afternoon. I'm John Tomasi. I'm the president of Heterodox Academy. HxA is a membership organization of over 6,000 professors and administrators from all around the world who share a common commitment to three main ideals: the ideals of open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. We are people who have different political views. We're a bipartisan or multi-partisan organization, sort of inevitably with that many members. But we share this idea, all of us, all the members of HxA, that our universities, like all of our social institutions, are constantly in a process of becoming. They're never fixed. They're never settled into one thing. They're always changing, and every generation has a responsibility to stand up and to try to make their institutions what they might be at their best. So at HxA, we work from the inside of our universities. We love our universities, and we hold them to a standard, maybe a Socratic kind of love. We hold them to the standard that we want them to be, and we're never satisfied, but we're always careful and truly sincerely trying to build the best of our universities. Many of you know that I'm the host of HxA's podcast, Heterodox Out Loud. Today's conversation is going to be a special Heterodox pop-up conversation. Our main topic is going to be on the idea of institutional neutrality, with references to the epic 1967 Kalven Report from the University of Chicago. We'll be talking about some other issues too. That issue, of course, has been much in the news since the Hamas attack of October 7th. In the aftermath, it's still roiling universities as presidents try to decide what to say, what they shouldn't have said, what they ought to say, or should they have said anything at all. So Kalven, this report from 1967, is suddenly back in the news. And our guest today, I'm really delighted to introduce is Jamie Kalven. Jamie is a highly regarded journalist and a community activist from Chicago. He's the founder of the Invisible Institute. Among his many accolades, in 2022, Jamie was awarded the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence from the Nieman Foundation of Journalism at Harvard. Jamie is also the son of Harry Kalven, who wrote that epic 1967 report. Jamie Kalven, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you.
It's nice to have you here. I emailed you out of the blue after reading some of your work on the Kalven Report on some other related issues. And when I emailed you out of the blue, I hear you Googled around about me and discovered we have some unusual, unexpected connections. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, to my who's this guy who emailed me? So I did the usual Google search and found in one of the biographical, capsule biographies of you that you grew up in Underhill Center, Vermont.
That's right.
And I have a deep connection to Underhill Center. We have to convey to people what a tiny dot on the map this is.
It is.
You know the population. I don't know it offhand, but a small little Vermont hamlet on the side of Mount Mansfield. And right. My wife is from the same small town, and for the last 40 odd years we've spent summers there and Christmas, and really raised our kids both on the south side of Chicago and in Underhill Center.
Nice. On the south side of Mount Mansfield.
And on the south side.
And I grew up on Pleasant Valley Road, and your family, or your wife's family, was up on Mountain Road, was just around the corner from us. So you drove by my house many times.
Countless times. And I run a loop when I'm there that takes me down Pleasant Valley Road.
I know that. I run that loop too. and I'll just add one more thing, if I may, that as I understand, as best we can understand. My grandparents moved to that tiny town when my grandparents were young in 1942, and they bought an old farmhouse. The barn had burned down, so it wasn't very valuable. And they bought a farmhouse with, I think, 300 acres. And as I understand, my mother babysat your wife.
She did, and your siblings. Yeah.
So that's our background.
Yeah.
I want to talk with you about your experience with your father. And I know that I mentioned that the Kalven Report, this extremely important report, this gem, a 2-page masterwork. And I tell some of my friends that the Kalven Report has this strange feature in the academic world, kind of a great rarity of being simultaneously beautifully written, extremely important, and brief.
Yeah.
It's unusual in the academic world to find someone
And
that.
I should say of my father that he was a very good writer. He was not known
Yes.
for brevity. So this was an unusual.
And to listeners who have not read the Kalven Report, I just highly recommend that you Google it and check it out. It's really it's a masterwork. It'll be 30 minutes, the best spent 30 minutes of your day if you read that. You could probably read it in 15. Your father, that report came out in 1967. Your father passed away quite suddenly in 1979, I believe.
74.
Oh, I'm sorry, 74. And he was, I think, 60 years old or barely 60.
Right.
He died at his desk, as I understand it, with a heart attack.
He died at his desk. He actually had health problems starting at 55. He had a heart attack. A couple of years later, a stroke, and then died at 60. And the last 5 years of his life, he devoted to a sustained effort to write a book that he conceived of at the beginning of his career and had talked about for years. And he was a very prolific writer, but writing kind of in response to events and law review articles and general magazines. And he had, in 1964, given lectures at Ohio State University, the title of which was The Negro and the First Amendment, use of the word Negro, obviously, of that time.
Yes.
Which was a really kind of fascinating, to this day, it's an interesting book to read, examining the contribution of the civil rights movement to First Amendment law. And so he had been actively engaged with First Amendment issues throughout his career. And as his health failed, he finally put other engagements aside to write the book he'd always wanted to write, which he conceived of as a sort of intellectual history of the First Amendment at the level of the Supreme Court, written obviously for lawyers, but also with some thought to a general audience. And he was in the midst of that book when he died. He was actually, as you say, at his desk. And I was early in my career as a writer, was very close to my father, had read the manuscript up to that point while he was alive. We talked about it, and ultimately, together with some of his colleagues, it was decided that the best approach with this extraordinary manuscript, and I should describe it a little bit, it was, I think, 1,200 pages, and it was literally a first draft. So if I gave you, John, a first draft and said, would you look at, it would be a fifth or sixth draft. And when I described it as a first draft, I would be saying it's still open to change. I'm still working on it. Right. In my dad's case, it was literally a first draft. And what he would do is, he was a very fluent writer. He would write, he would immerse himself in a particular body of First Amendment law. He would write. And then each summer, he was an academic. So each summer when he was on vacation, he would take his manuscript with him, read through it, and write marginalia, write a set of marginal comments to himself. And the marginalia, extended from like an exclamation mark next to something to full pages on the backside of a manuscript critiquing nice. his own work.
Nice.
So, after he died, there's this kind of masterwork, but in a very vulnerable condition, not completed, with gaps, first draft. And somewhat quixotically, I undertook, with the support of various colleagues of my dad's who helped and were kind of editorial sounding boards, I undertook to finish it. And, more than a decade later, it was published under the title A Worthy Tradition, Freedom of Speech in America.
And I should mention, just for listeners who don't know, that Harry Kalven was one of the most important First Amendment jurisprudents of the last century. and was, party to a lot of these extremely important breakthroughs that are being made in that century about what is the scope of this thing, the First Amendment. How wide is it? How narrow is it? What is it? Where are the exceptions? How do you fill it out? So it was it was remarkable. And as I remember, you were in your 20s, I think, or late
Yeah,
20s.
I was in my mid-20s when I started,
Wow.
and had published a little bit and was really sort of rehearsing a career as a journalist rather than fully established. And this became my apprenticeship. I mean, completely foundational experience for me. I was very, very close to my father, and I think my sensibilities, sense of language, sort of formed in conversation with him from childhood on. But the uncanny thing about this project was that the conversation, I mean, I don't want to minimize the grief and the sense of loss and the disruption, but the conversation intensified after his death through the medium of this very taxing and utterly consuming project.
I want to talk to you about the Kalven Report.
Yeah.
We can talk about the report itself. Maybe I'll do that first, just a little bit, and then we can talk about whether you found anything in the notes as you were working through them. So the Kalven Report, as you know, is this brief statement that stakes out a position on the question of what role universities should have in social and political action.
Yeah.
And most of the weight of the report is to establish a heavy presumption against university presidents, for example, speaking out on controversial political issues on behalf of the university. And among the beautiful, famous lines from that report that your father was the chairperson of is this line that the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. And that the university on this ideal is a truth-seeking organization directed at that mission of learning and teaching, but that the appropriate unit of the criticism of critic for the university is going to be the individual professors and I'll add students as well. Is that a reasonable explanation or a summary of the report?
I think that's a fair statement of the report. And presumption is the key word, because there's also allowance for exceptions to this general principle, but the exceptions aren't spelled out. Right. So I can't remember the exact language. You may have it in front of you, but maybe worth quoting that.
I'll read it if I may, and I'll read actually. Well, I'll read two things. Just at the very beginning of the report. So I should add that the Kalven Report is being discussed so much now, and there is kind of grown up around it what I think of as almost a Kalven absolutism.
Hmm.
Universities who sign on to this report or this ideal of neutrality as expressed in the report, and there could be other explications of institutional neutrality that are different than this report.
Yeah.
Kalven's principle is basically the idea that the university achieves neutrality by not speaking at all. Rival conceptions of neutrality might say the university can speak, but should do it in an even-handed way. That could also be a way to find neutrality. But this report emphasizes, the main weight of the report emphasizes the idea that universities should not speak on these controversial topics so as to not crowd out the voices of dissenting professors and students who have different views. And a couple of lines I'll just read from the very beginning of the report. It says that the committee conceives its function principally of providing, quote, a point of departure for discussion in the university. And at the very end, and it's framed at the very end of the report, we hear this line that they've established a quote heavy presumption against the university taking collective action or making these kind of statements. So the report's framed with these very nuanced, short, powerful notices that this is an invitation to a conversation, the beginnings of a conversation. And now, more substantively, the famous clause in the middle, I call it the Kalven clause. I'll read it aloud if I may. So they've established this ideal of the university as this place for this very special institution for raucous conversations.
Mhm.
That it's not an act of cowardice for the university not to take stands. Rather, it's an act of bravery, because it's saying the university, by being quiet, is making maximal space for the professors and students to speak their mind and their various minds that they might have.
Yeah.
And then we come across this Kalven clause, as I call it. I'll read it out loud. From time to time, instances will arise in which the society, or segments of it, threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry. In such a crisis, it becomes the obligation of the university as an institution to oppose such measures and to actively defend its interests and its values. So the clause, and I was saying, it's a heavy presumption about not speaking, but the clause says there may be times when the very mission of the university and its commitment to free inquiry and its interests and its values need to be defended. What do you make of that clause?
I think that's key. So a couple of observations. One is, every word in the report was written by my father. It's his voice, it's his diction, it's his use of language. But the report came out of a committee process in which there were multiple tensions between committee members, quite distinct viewpoints.
One can imagine.
Some of which track some of the current controversy about institutional neutrality. And so my dad was in the position of, it's something that he actually very much appreciated in sort of judicial craftsmanship. So, we all can be stirred by a flaming dissent from a judge or, a Supreme Court justice, which is the equivalent of writing a polemical essay, in your own voice.
Yeah.
But there is another form of what my dad called judicial statesmanship,
Nice. I love that.
where a judge is trying to build a majority in support of an important principle and has to accommodate contending views within the judges who will constitute that majority.
Right.
And sometimes that produces internal contradiction and squishy language and, bad writing in judicial
Right.
decisions. I think this is an example where those tensions within this collegial group making a joint statement sort of forced both a level of abstraction, it sort of forced them to a level of abstraction and to the kind of elegant formulations that you've noted. So the idea that this is a presumption, it's not an absolutist stance. It's a strong presumption. There are exceptions that can be entertained to that presumption. And, in the law, principles are defined by their the limits on their application. I mean, it's you define the parameters of a principle by where you don't apply it as well as where you apply it. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that notion that it's a point of departure, inviting a conversation. And I think what my dad and I think when I went back into his files with respect to the Kalven Report, I found some language to this effect. There's a communication to other members of the committee saying, in effect, we only have an opportunity to say something once, and we have a choice between strongly stating the principle. And again, I can't remember the exact language, but the idea was, or trying to anticipate all the different forms that exceptions to the principle might take, like a lawyer writing a contract or something.
I have that language. May I read it?
Yeah, please.
And I found it in this just really fascinating piece that you wrote in 2006, which I also want to highly recommend to our listeners. It's called Unfinished Business of the Kalven Report. So again, it's called The Unfinished Business of the Kalven Report. by Jamie Kalven, November 28th, 2006. And I'm interested in how you came to write this piece, and I'll ask you about that in a moment. But just the passage you were just referring to, you quote him a memo he wrote to the committee, and I'll just read it out loud. And it's tracking exactly what you just described. Your father wrote, quote, he wrote to the committee, quote, "It seems to me, particularly after struggling with the drafting, that we have a tricky choice of where to spend our emphasis." Elegant phrase. Where to spend our emphasis. I think we can only spend it once effectively. And the question is whether we spend it in stating the general principle against collective action, or spend it in sketching the exceptional case in which collective action may be appropriate. Close quote. And you go on to say that he opted and suggested to the committee that they spend it once.
Right. And that was the resolution. But I think it also is tied to something that you highlighted in your initial framing, which is this notion that the statement of the Kalven Committee is a point of departure. It's not engraved in stone. It's not a tablet handed down. It is a point of departure for what I think he foresaw. And I think his First Amendment, his writing about First Amendment jurisprudence is relevant here. I think he foresaw a kind of common law process unfolding from this point of departure, the statement of a principle, that there would be an ongoing dialogue, that events would present new questions, that successive generations would grapple with those questions, and that there would be a body of reflection and experience that built over time. And if I have a criticism of and I have several, but of the way in which the Kalven Report has been deployed at the University of Chicago, and I imagine elsewhere, is too often it's been used as a kind of shield against having that conversation. It's sort of been used to shut down the conversation rather than an availability to really engage. And I think that's a fair reading in the context of my father's work generally, of where that language was, pointing. And there's a relevant, I described before the marginalia in his First Amendment manuscript. There's a wonderful passage, all of this is sort of handwritten and his tight handwriting. And I think it's on the backside of a manuscript page. And he was a great admirer of Hugo Black, Justice Hugo Black, who particularly at times in the post-war period and the anti-communist era, when other justices were kind of losing their bearings and with the anti-communist anxieties, Hugo Black was just a kind of North Star of clarity. But Black had a kind of absolute reading of the First Amendment.
Right.
Congress shall make no law means Congress shall make no law, period.
Right. Yes.
And so what my dad's note says, acknowledging Black's sort of gallantry and all there is to admire in his performance as a justice, he, there's a passage kind of critiquing Black in that vein. And at the end, he writes, "As for my own view, I think of the First Amendment as being almost an absolute."
Right.
And the almost means you have to win the argument by sweat every time. I think that was the way he put it. And I think that's the critical thing that has often been missing from the way in which the Kalven Report has been, or at least been perceived as using, students and others perceive administrations as using it. That almost is critical, because that means you're open and available to grapple with whatever the particular issue being presented is. It isn't dispositive of the question. The presumption remains. But I think there's been something kind of miseducating about the way in which the report has often been used just to slam the door on discourse rather than demonstrably allowing for it.
I'm going to ask you, I'd like to ask you more about that. So that's That's my reading of Kalven as well, and it's also my reading of some of the way it's being deployed, you might say. The report does say, as I mentioned, that this position that they're advocating is not happening, it's not out of cowardice or lack of commitment. It's rather a daring endeavor to allow this freedom of speech to happen. And yet there are these questions that almost absolute is where so much of the action was in the last century that your father was very involved in. What does it mean? Free speech, but does that mean you can have fraudulent claims on commercial products? Well, that's
Yeah.
speech. Does
Yeah.
it mean you can incite violence, in an immediate case? Well, that's speech. And so there's a lot of work that was done to figure out, what does this mean? And by carving out the exceptions, if we're going to call them that, one has to reflect and understand more deeply the meaning and value of the core principle. And you say something in this this beautiful essay of yours, The Unfinished Business of the Kalven Report, that I'm going to quote, and this is you now, not your father. You talk about that almost.
Yeah.
And you say that the tradition of freedom of speech takes the form of arguing about the content of that tradition. And now you say, and a key measure of our stewardship of First Amendment values is the quality of that argument. On this view, a principle is not diminished, but clarified and deepened by the process of mapping its boundaries.
Yeah.
Which is I think it's a really beautiful and I think accurate description of the exciting path of First Amendment jurisprudence, especially over the past, say, 60, 70 years. And I wonder about the Kalven Report. I wonder about it. I mentioned this to you in an email. I wonder if there's an analogy that with First Amendment law, due to the work of your father and many others of his generation, and is ongoing, of course.
Yeah.
We're developing an ever more sophisticated understanding of what the First Amendment is by carving out some of those exceptions. I wonder, I'm just sort of playing with this idea. I kind of feel that with the idea of institutional neutrality in the university setting, we're similarly in our infancy,
Yeah.
in our understanding of what those interesting exceptions sketched out in the report. Is it big enough to drive a truck through? What kind of truck? When trucks? And what do you think of that? Do you think that
Yeah,
the
I think what's been missing, at least, I should be clear, I'm not an academic. I'm a writer. I'm out under the broad umbrella of the First Amendment. I'm engaged in First Amendment controversies of various sorts. That's my work. So I have an almost ethnographic relationship to academia. I'm here a few blocks away from the University of Chicago campus. I work, collaborate with academics, but I'm really coming at these things from another perspective and as a journalist. And my observation is, compared to the rigor and richness of First Amendment jurisprudence at its best, that the principle of institutional neutrality has not been subjected to that kind of process. And maybe now there's an opportunity for that because, it's been such a mess post October 7th for so many institutions. This feels like there might be space when the dust settles for a kind of a reset and a kind of reconsideration of some of these questions. And I don't think the answer is just to push forward the Kalven principle, absent other kinds of interventions. And, because I think part of what may have been alienating for some students about the way the Kalven Report has been used by various institutions is it's not sufficient in itself. It states a principle, but if institutions are really going to make good on a principle of a commitment to robust debate and really a commitment to dissent, a commitment to creating the conditions for vigorous dissent, for vigorous disagreement, I think that requires more of the institution than just articulation of the principle. And so I'm wondering if we're now maybe, as so many university presidents and administrations are kind of reeling from these last weeks, if there's now not an opening for a richer set of conversations within individual institutions and more broadly about precisely these questions. The other thing, John, that I would emphasize is, as I said, I sort of swim in these broader First Amendment waters. That's what I do, and I'm an investigative journalist. I get subpoenaed for my notes in court.
I know. I want to ask you about that too.
The city is trying to hold me in contempt. So that's one zone. That's one zone of the First Amendment, and and I expect to be attacked. And it's just it's a rugby scrum. I think part of what sometimes gets conflated in a problematic way is universities are a different space. They have a deep and a profound relationship to the larger discourse of a democratic society, but there's an opportunity within universities to do something that, especially in this current climate and this era we're living in, is all but impossible to do in the broader public sphere, which is really asking what are the necessary conditions for people to fully inhabit their intellectual freedom? What are the necessary conditions for robust argument that doesn't devolve into people want to tearing each other's heads off?
Right.
And there's always been that. I think the person I most associate among thinkers with that sort of distinction is Alexander Meiklejohn. I don't know if you're aware of Meiklejohn's work.
Very well.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think he was the president of Amherst, and I think provost at Brown, and
right.
But he, in the post-war period, became passionately and really bravely, courageously engaged with First Amendment issues.
Yes.
But for Meiklejohn, the question was always, what are the requirements of being self-governing citizens?
That's right.
And so the broad principles were key to that, but also education was key to it. So, and I think if we could get back to that sort of basic set of questions, and thinking as a journalist, and I've promoted this idea with some folks at the University of Chicago, what would we learn if we did a really rigorous institutional audit, asking people, in a well-designed kind of inquiry about their lived experience within the university in terms of their freedom to think, to dissent, to I think there's a danger with First Amendment discourse, and certainly with the Kalven, the discourse around the Kalven Report, to live wholly in a sort of abstract conceptual realm in how we debate and inquire and engage. And I think, especially post October 7th, the possibility of really doing a rich kind of diagnostic inquiry. How's it working for you? How's it working on your campus?
I should mention at this point that that Heterodox Academy, we work on the cultural piece. We're interested. We work closely with organizations like Fire, which is an essentially legal organization that defends the rights of individuals, or speech rights, the rights to due process on campuses and beyond now. HxA partners with them, not so much on the legal side, but rather we ask, well, once you have free speech protections at a university, what's the quality of conversation?
Right.
How brave are they? And we run a big survey every year, on a large national survey called the Campus Expression Survey, the CES, which examines these things. We find, this in the most recent report this year, one of our findings, a trend line we've been watching, is that students often report that they self-censor, not because of their concern about the ideology of their professor. They self-censor because they're concerned about their fellow students.
Peer group, yeah.
In particular, what they're going to say on social media. They float an idea in class just to try it out, and they worried about being quoted. I want to go. Oh, I'm sorry.
I do think that line of inquiry, especially now, would really elevate the discourse about the Kalven Report and that constellation of questions. And I've done I did some reporting years ago where that involved some issues around the University of Chicago closing down access to the emergency room. An urban university situated on a largely Black South Side. And there were ER doctors who were more frightened to speak to me as sources than whistleblowing cops I've reported on, and wrongfully convicted individuals caught up in the criminal, and I think we can't look past that. Both the peer culture that people fear, and not just students, I think faculty increasingly, and the more institutional dynamic. If your department head has taken a strong position on this, that, or the other, and you're, junior faculty,
Right.
does that inhibit you?
That's right. And there's also a lot of attention now that we're now really working on to think about what are the academic freedom rights of students. Can students speak out? If they do, are they vulnerable for being doxxed? What's that realm of protections there? I want to ask you, just to again stay on the Kalven Report just for a little bit more. When the attacks happened on October 7th, one of the things we observed that was most striking was that there was a lack of statements made by college presidents in the immediate aftermath. The Chronicle of Higher Education wrote a piece on October 10th, and their informal survey, they can only identify 14 university presidents that had made statements on the topic. And the context in which university presidents have been making statements on every imaginable at an ever increasing rate, in recent years, and that was taken to be a kind of speech by itself. And some people that started thinking, well, some of these university presidents, well, maybe they should take a principled position to not now the timing is, and the transition is a difficult question. What's the right moment to make that decision? I'm not sure that was the right time to do that, because it looked like it was the Kalven Report of convenience.
Yeah,
but it was Calvinizing for convenience. But there was a sense, I think, on some university campuses and some administrations that the Kalven could be like, the Kalven is cavalry. It'll come over the hill and say, oh, good, here's our way out of this. We don't need to speak anymore. And I think there's something important about that, and I'm grateful that universities are now actually thinking seriously about this report and about the principles within it. But I want to ask you a little bit more about what those exceptions might be. And I was going to give you I'll share some with you that you may find interesting. I did a podcast. HxA sponsored I've been involved in 2 podcasts in the last week. One was co-sponsored between HxA and Fire to talk about the Kalven Report and the idea of institutional neutrality. And then HxA sponsored one just last week with that I hosted. It was with Nadine Strawson, the former head of the ACLU, and Keith Whittington, a really distinguished professor at Princeton. Keith and I actually have been working on an edited volume on the Kalven Report. And you may enjoy this, because when Keith and I decided to put together this volume of critical essays on the Kalven Report, we decided this last winter, I think. We actually had kind of a hard time getting people to agree to write chapters for us. And we also shopped our book idea to a variety of presses, including one press that's very close to you. And at the time,
I can actually see their offices.
I'm not naming names. I'm just saying we found a press that we're very happy with it, but it was kind of interesting to find, wow, this is not a hot topic. But now, of course, it's on everyone's mind. But just going back to that clause that I meant, the Kalven clause, the bit that says there may be instances will arise under times of crisis when it has an obligation to speak to defend its interests and its values. On that call I had just recently with Nadine Strawson and with Keith Whittington, I asked them a couple of test cases. So they both endorsed the Kalven Report in a strong version, and the Fire people also endorsed a very strong, what I view as a very strong reading of the rigidity and the strength of that neutrality principle, and the non-speak principle. And I said, well, what about, for example, a recent Supreme Court case that says that which decided that universities may not engage in affirmative action in admissions. And I asked both Nadine and Keith, do you think the Kalven clause would kick in that instance? Is that the kind of thing that the university president should speak out about? And they both said it's not. They both said no. Kalven would say, let that be out there for the students and professors to talk about, and the university should take no stand on that. And I pressed a bit more. I said, well, what about an administration which starts taxing endowments? Is that the kind of thing they should speak out about? Or what about an administration which puts a ban across people coming from, say, Muslim countries, students and faculty too? Or as you now see in the House, there's a bill that's been talked about, a ban perhaps on Gazans coming to the U.S. Those all seem to affect the essential functioning of the mission. I didn't ask them about all those questions, my colleague, but my sense was that a lot of people would say, well, no, Kalven says we don't get involved in that. What's your take on that?
So I think that the latter example is particularly striking, because here at the University of Chicago, one instance of the former president, Robert Zimmer, taking a public position was in response to restrictions on immigration that would have affected students' ability to access the university. That seems to me very plausible, as an exception. I mean, there you have something that is directly affecting the functioning, the core functions of the university, and also something on which there's real competence to speak as a university president. I mean, I think I think you said something earlier that suggested this. I think, people now have spoken out on so many things, and particularly in the post-George Floyd era, you get this kind of performative, almost branding operation that is completely unedifying. And I think it's rendered.
There's something corporate about some of the statements.
It's like corporations giving millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, but not changing any of their underlying practices. And I think the vulnerability of any number of university presidents in this moment, to now invoke the Kalven Report as a shield, it is just not credible when you're pronouncing on all these other things. And I'm not minimizing the gravity and importance of those subjects. It's just what's the value added, and what is the special authority to speak. And I think one of the things I wanted to come back to is I find myself troubled by the term neutrality, which I think is part of how students and others who are kind of disposed to misread the underlying values in play. It's just, it just seems morally intolerable to be neutral as to what's happening in the Middle East right now.
Exactly.
Right?
That's right.
It seems to me there can be moral dignity in being silent about it. And especially when the silence is generative, when the silence is allowing for other voices and for other processes to fill the public sphere, the academic sphere. But I think the other advantage of silence is it lends gravity to your speech when you do speak.
That's right.
So I think Zimmer, in a certain sense, got it right. That was you could argue it both ways, but there was certainly a plausible exception to the Kalven Report.
Right.
And it resonated because of silence on any number of other issues that the president was invited to speak on.
There was another instance. I don't know the details well, but I know the outline at least. Again, at Chicago, while Zimmer was president, of a department, I believe it was the English department, making it in the wake of George Floyd, making it the decision to, and again, as I recall, to only admit graduate students for the next year or two who worked on issues of race in America.
Yeah.
So they made a decision, and some people, some critics, so wait a minute, this is a violation of neutrality. They're now taking a position as a unit within the university. And Zimmer actually came down in favor of the department's ability, right, to make autonomy to make that kind of a decision. They said, this is a decision units make. They may get it right, they may get it wrong, but we empower them to make these decisions themselves, not endorsing their decision or criticizing, just saying that's the bet they're making. But it was, again, one of these kind of moments where Kalven didn't just answer all the questions. It required, and this another a term you used before. I want to bring it back around to the Kalven principle. I just read a really fascinating draft of an essay by Robert Post, a very distinguished law professor at Yale. It's a draft of an essay he's writing for the volume that Keith Whittington and I are working on. And one of the things he talks about is he worries a bit that the Kalven principle, taken strictly, do not speak, it obviates, or it anticipates and it disables an ideal of a certain idea of statesmanship on the part of university presidents. Now, cynics will say, we don't want statesmanship from university presidents. Thank you. We've had enough other attempts to do that in the corporate way. But I think the idea there is that there should be some space, I think, in a principle to be principled, to express the educational content of this ideal as an important piece of active bravery, while also allowing the space for something like presidential statesmanship.
Yeah, and I would use a different, I like the term statesmanship, but I would really use a term more fundamental, which is judgment. So, one of the things I found fascinating as a non-lawyer about my immersion in constitutional law, working on my dad's book, was sort of the question of what makes a good judge? What makes a great judge? And there are many ways to go at that question or answer it. But one of the things that struck me was that the life of the society will continuously generate new and difficult issues. And what you ideally want are judges who are immersed in and have absorbed and the collective experience with related issues and with all the competing values in play. And it's not that they have a recipe or that they have an a priori answer. It's that body of experience informs their judgment.
Yes.
And I think that, in a curious way, is what, if you were going to be harsh, you would say is missing from the interpretation over time and the development of the Kalven Report. If you were being generous, you would say is sort of embryonic at this stage and can still happen.
That's what I think.
But yeah, I think that, and I think especially if there's we're at a kind of watershed moment with respect to these issues in light of what's been happening in recent weeks. I think one thing that would be interesting, just like our exchange of a few minutes ago, talking about particular instances of exceptions or your hypotheticals, would be actually to go back and look at the body of experience at the University of Chicago and elsewhere. There have been a number of occasions when students, faculty, some combination, have pressed the university to take an institutional position. There have been a handful of instances where they have. There are circumstances elsewhere, in other institutions. And I think it just would be very instructive to kind of gather that, almost like, a casebook.
It would be fascinating.
Just gather, and then begin to make some, is there real in Chicago and elsewhere, if you really look at this cumulative body of experience, is there a coherent kind of common law thread that runs through it? Or is it more transactional and maybe not so satisfying intellectually? And if that's the case, can we almost retroactively discern a more refined set of guidelines? That's right. I think it's a fascinating exercise at this point.
And I'll also just mention that in this essay of yours, which again I just think so much of the unfinished business of the Kalven Report, you describe that you're getting your involvement as because you were approached by some students at Chicago who were concerned to see whether I think it was a divestment in Sudan, right?
Right.
It
During
it was a
yeah,
Darfur situation. And you just describe how you saw the students, you charitably, I think I'm going to assume accurately, the students approached you, as I recall, and they asked, could they look at your father's papers in the
right.
library? Because as I understood it, you said they were seeking to meet that burden. They were accepting, okay, there's this burden, and now we're going to see whether we can meet it,
Yeah,
which is playing within the rules of Kalven, and yet also thinking, well, let's take the exception seriously and see whether this is such an instance.
right. And they were so serious and really rigorous and rhetorically, very effective. So it was really the students who moved me to go dig into my father's papers again, and occasioned that essay you referred to. And I think, again, I don't know. I think they got close at the level of the board of trustees. There was real discussion. Um, I don't know what the right answer was, but it felt like the right process. It felt like the right process.
That's nice. And something you might also just an experience I had recently you may find interesting. I wondered whether Kalven applies equally at every university, or does the context matter? So in that clause that I mentioned, they talk about actively defend its interests and its values, but different universities have different kinds of values.
Completely.
A whole variety. I was giving a talk 2 weeks ago in Madrid for a large group of academics, our European HxA members. And I was talking about the Kalven principle and the Kalven report, and I was, just describing it with considerable enthusiasm. And one of the questions I got from the audience was from a priest who runs a university in Rome. And he said, well, does this mean that Catholic universities should not speak out on matters that are essential to the faith? Does Kalven not allow that? Do you have a thought about that?
No, it's interesting. I think when you said it, I was thinking of just the variety of the plurality of universities, and so again, I think every effort should be taken to engage with the principle without rigid application of the principle. And it just feels to me at this point like there's an opportunity for within institutions, and maybe in a kind of broader discourse like your academy promotes, for kind of going back to that point of departure that my dad plotted in the initial utterance, and renewing the conversation, paying some attention to empirical realities and differences within different institutions and maybe within different departments. I mean, I think that, one of the things that distinguished my father's First Amendment scholarship was just attention to the particularity of First Amendment issues, as opposed to looking for a grand unitary theory.
Interesting.
That you could bring, and again, a way of being intelligent, a way of exercising judgment, not coming with an a priori template for how you manage things.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I think that feels like an important value here. And I think the other thing that is important to be mindful of, and I have a small organization, and my colleagues are all incomprehensibly younger than I am. Some of them products of the University of Chicago. And these are some of the most intelligent, morally sensitive young people I know.
Lovely.
They are almost all, except for their, affection for me and regard for me, they are almost all alienated from the First Amendment. They see the First Amendment, and by extension, the Kalven Report, as tools of the power structure.
I was going to ask you about that. That's
and
right.
They have reason to. I mean, I think they have reason to, in terms of various trends in society. And I think that is a really critical factor on campuses that should be taken into account. And I think that those advocating for institutional neutrality, for the Kalven Report, for this constellation of values, should also acknowledge some degree of failure,
right,
in having students of great moral seriousness be as reflexively alienated and distrustful of these, what we regard as core values, they regard as tools of power.
right.
And obviously they can be tools of power, but they can also, empower the disenfranchised, empower the folks at the margins. And so how to kind of address that matters a lot. And again, if there's an opening coming to renew some of these conversations, I think it's important to be mindful that if this is a tradition, and the key, I gave you the title of my dad's book, A Worthy Tradition, really central. I titled it, but based on language I found in his papers, the really central animating idea in the book is that the First Amendment in American life is really a tradition that transcends positive law. That's really been hugely important to me in my career. So I don't, I am guided by an understanding of the First Amendment as a practitioner, as a kind of frontline journalist. I don't regard the parameters of the First Amendment as being defined by the latest decision of the Roberts Court. For me, it comes out of this larger body of collective experience. It includes the dissents, it includes the debacles, it includes the shameful, cowardly decisions. All of that informs my sense of the First Amendment. And you, in your opening description of your academy, you were talking about the responsibilities of successive generations. And I think we have to acknowledge some really serious degree of breakdown in the transmission of these values across generations now.
Clearly. And it was in the 1960s when Marcuse wrote his essay against toleration, repressive tolerance, which is a classic essay saying that these ideas of neutrality are masks for power, and they reproduce what came before them, which has been a really, just on the intellectual level, a really powerful,
challenging
brand of thinking that, in my own view, calls on us, those of us who love our universities, to be ready, to stand ready, not just to repeat John Stuart Mill and give them John Stuart Mill's book again and again, but to I used to assign it at Brown, and they say, we're kind of tired of hearing John Stuart Mill from you. Can we hear something new? And but they mean that in a serious, I think, and just the way you said, some people are not serious, but many of the students who would say those things are really, they're wanting to hear why the First Amendment matters. They're wanting to hear why institutional neutrality might matter. There's so much more I want to talk with you about regarding Kalven. I've been following it minutely, as you can probably guess, and a number of universities in the past week or two have made statements in favor of the neutrality ideal. Most notably Northwestern, where they took on, I think they explicitly said this is a Kalven generated set of ideas. And then another one striking was at Williams, and the president of Williams, Maud Mandel, she said in her statement to the community that I've made lots of statements on lots of topics. You all know that, but my thinking's evolved, she said. And evolution to me suggests a growth and a progress. Now, evolution could, I'm going to keep on evolving, a month from now and go back to my old way. But evolution suggests something like, I did that, now I'm learning. And another striking example that a lot of us are talking about is at Stanford, where Stanford came out early for neutrality, but then released a statement condemning the attacks a few days later. And is that a contradiction? I'm not actually sure that it is a contradiction, but it's a lot of people sort of think of it that way. So there's much more to be said about Kalven. It's kind of wonderful to see it on the agenda the way it is.
I think that it's been exciting for me and sort of fascinating.
I'm sure.
Delighted to be pulled into the conversation. I think that the challenge now is, and maybe your organization has a key role to play in this, is maybe to be somewhat less prescriptive and more kind of thinking strategically about what processes would look like within universities to build understanding within the community and buy-in within the community to these principles. And
That's right.
and I think that's the key thing. Given the degree of student alienation, given how reflexive and polarized so much discourse is, for other reasons, I think there has to be, maybe the best way to put it is to go back to what I said a moment ago. What if there were a way of inviting people to go back to my father's point of departure?
Right.
To sort of acknowledge that this has been I don't want to use too strong language, but a sharply instructive period of this last month. And sometimes messes and the collapse of a paradigm is a really creative space.
Yes.
But I think the question is how to inhabit and activate that space and not just leave the wreckage and people even deeper in their entrenched positions.
Nice.
That's a process question. It's not simply asserting the principle.
And I think you might be glad to know that there are a number of we have groups of professors all around the country, and some of those groups are actively working on this now, often with their administrations, thinking, well, how can we craft a set of principles based on neutrality, based on Kalven, that is nonetheless correct for that university and this time, and to provide some spaces for statesmanship while also really trying to be true to that ideal that the university is this sort of daring experiment of allowing diversity of thought and not crowding it out and not having those endless statements that assume that everyone thinks the same way. We've spent more time on Kalven than I intended, so we're going to spend less time on another really important topic that I just really want to talk with you about and share with our listeners, just about your experience as a journalist. One of the many lines of yours that I've read lately that I really enjoyed in the last week preparing for this conversation, a line you say, I'll quote you. I can't remember where I found this one. I just wrote it down on a piece of paper because I liked it so much. You said, I believe ultimately in defending the First Amendment by practicing it.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about that. So you had this experience as a young man, your father tragically dying, and picking up his manuscript. And a remarkable. I read Owen Fiss's review in the New York Times describing it as an act of heroism of a certain type, a really beautiful a paean to you and what you had done as a young man for your father and for the country to do that, to finish that book. You had a difficult experience with your wife had an extremely difficult experience that I think around that time sort of turned your attention. Would you share something about that?
Sure. So my wife, Patricia Evans, a wonderful documentary photographer, and we collaborate, and have collaborated over the years. Really soon after the publication of my father's book, was out running on the lakefront in Chicago, training for a marathon in the middle of the afternoon, beautiful September day, and was brutally attacked and could easily have been killed. It was a sexual assault that she was ultimately able to escape, but was really brutalized in the course of it. And it happened at a point, we'd emerged from the book, we had two small children, deeply invested in our community on the south side of Chicago. And I have to say in this that I was really guided by my wife. And this relates to our point of departure in talking about Underhill, Vermont. Certainly her family and friends in Vermont saying, well, why don't you just move back, move away from this,
Right.
this kind of harm and this kind of threat. And, as I say, we were mature. We weren't kids when this happened. And her sense was that the real injury, and she, as I said, is a documentary photographer, traveled all over the world, has been in, we've been in the middle of essentially race riots together, reporting on them. She's done incredibly sort of courageous work as a photographer, as a traveling alone in the world. And her sense was that she had, by way of something done to her physically, to her body, she had been robbed of her ability to be in the world and move through the world. It was the theft of her freedom in the world that was the injury. And we talked, a great deal about it. And ultimately, it wasn't my idea. Actually, it was an editor in New York who knew us during those years, who had been the editor on my father's book, who, watching us go through this process over a couple of years, suggested, well, why don't you consider writing a book about it? And so and the book really grows out. I mean, I'm the author and it's my voice, but it grows out of ongoing conversations over a period of years with my wife. So the book is titled,
Remind me of the name of the book.
the book is titled Working with Available Light.
That's right.
Which has multiple levels of meaning, and it's the kind of photographer she is, but also is meant to acknowledge my, at best, partial knowledge of her experience.
Right.
The person closest in the world to her, but still,
Yes.
not to presume more than partial knowledge. But in the context of working on the book, a major theme for us became, where did this happen? I mean, we knew the precise place on the lakefront where it happened, but what world did this happen in? And the book explores that, but it also was sort of propulsive for the kind of work we both do. And so, I didn't mention this before, but both of us, led very adventurous lives before we met. And, I've mountaineered all over the world. I rode a motorcycle
Beyond Mount Mansfield.
beyond Mount Mansfield.
Or 4,000 feet of it, but
no, I've climbed everywhere, and a friend and I drove a motorcycle from Paris to New Delhi when we were in college, lived in the foothills of the Himalayas for a year and a half. My wife similarly traveled, all over, often alone. And what happened is that energy, once I was released from my father's book, and with our focus and sense of occasion, I think, sharpened by the violence that entered our lives, I undertook, and Patsy, very energetically joined me in bringing that same kind of energy to exploring my native place. And my native place isn't Underhill; it's the south side of Chicago. And
is that when you founded the Invisible Institute?
No, what happened is, over a period of years, I was involved in various initiatives around the South Side, and I became increasingly involved in high-rise public housing in Chicago. So in those years, we're talking the 90s, Chicago, close to where we live, had the biggest concentration of public housing and the biggest concentration of poverty in the country, a kind of Soweto-like city within the city that was visible everywhere, these high rises, but nobody ever went there. And there was all sorts of folklore about these places. And, I became more and more involved in that world, first as an organizer, developing employment programs, working with the resident leadership, and then reporting out of that environment. And so, that really was that experience over more than a decade, until the buildings all were demolished and the residents forced to relocate, is kind of the foundation of the reporting I've done since. And in about 2000, we began to report from high-rise public housing, and that was a period when you could publish online and get into anybody's email box. So there was, there weren't the spam filters and all the things. And so we were doing reporting. My wife's a great photographer. We had a good graphic person. I'm a mature reporter. So we were doing reporting from a vacant unit in a public housing high rise with the drug dealing marketplace right outside the door. If you come to visit me there, you know, somebody dealing drugs, you say, "Where's Jamie?" And he would direct you to me.
Right.
And so we started publishing something called The View from the Ground. The idea being that, that we're sort of recruiting reality on behalf of the residents, attacking the disconnect between public discourse and observable reality.
Fascinating.
When we started publishing, as a kind of you'll forgive me, but a mild sneer towards academia and policy, policy types, I said that this insurgent thing was being published under the auspices of the Invisible Institute. It was a wisecrack. And the name just sort of followed us around.
Nice.
And ultimately, many years later, in 2014, we won a big lawsuit in which I was the plaintiff that resulted in
This is Kalven versus City of Chicago.
Yeah, which resulted in a ruling which has been very impactful, that police disciplinary records are public information in Illinois. So right. Citizen complaints against the police and the investigations that are undertaken belong to the public in Illinois, which is, right. And there are very few jurisdictions with that level of transparency. Once we had broken down official secrecy and had access to this body of information, we actually, it's against my nature. I really prefer the kind of loose, open conspiracy way of operating. We needed to create a real organization to be worthy of that moment. And the name was inevitably the Invisible Institute.
Lovely. It's lovely.
Yeah.
I read about that case long before I know I'd be having this conversation with you. Yeah. So it was kind of fun to come around and to hear about that. Yeah. I want to close with something. I'd love to talk with you for hours, and maybe we'll meet in Underhill and have a cup of tea. And
I'd love to do that.
That'd be really fun. but I want to close with something else of yours that I read. It's an op-ed. I haven't seen the title on it now. It's about libraries. I'm sorry. It's about bookstores. And it's this lovely piece you wrote. I don't see the title here. It was published in the Chicago Tribune, December 27th, 2022. And it's an account of what bookstores are like. And you may remember some of the things you say. You talk about how you capture the civic importance of a bookstore in a way that I found really striking. You say that you wander amidst the endless possibilities of the books, shelves containing books written just for you, books that are portals to take you into a deeper world, books with the power to change your life, books that, as you say, deepen the quality of your attention. And then you say this, and it has a heterodox note that I was just struck by. So I'll read the whole paragraph. Okay. And again, you're describing the experience of the waning, perhaps, experience of walking around a bookstore and spending time there among the books. And you say, I'll quote you, "There were no guardrails in a good bookstore, no trigger warnings. Just as there are titles within reach that would enrich your life, there are others that would appall you. A bookstore is, in that sense, a violent place. To conceive of the books on its shelves as engaged in civilized conversation with one another is half truth, half delusion. War, not conversation, is the mode of interaction between many books. Yet the place that houses these contending visions and impassioned quarrels represents the possibilities of understanding and conciliation And then you close by saying, it encompasses our divisions and holds the promise that we may yet recover the democratic knack for arguing constructively with one another, close quote. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, it actually, I'm so appreciate you, excavating that. I think it relates deeply to what we're talking about with respect to what universities are. And, there's language, I think when I said no guardrails, I was uh, implicitly referencing Hannah Arendt, who says somewhere, who has one of her titles is without banisters.
Yeah.
The idea being that thinking is actually dangerous.
Yeah.
Thinking is a dangerous activity. If we're seriously engaging with serious questions that bear on the human condition and the human prospect, this is dangerous stuff. And universities at their best are uniquely places dedicated to that essential and dangerous practice, of thinking and of the sort of discourse with one another that enlarges our thinking.
Nice.
Nice. It's in debate with one another that we enlarge our thinking. And I think, I really do appreciate you landing on that passage. What's always struck me is the husbandry and management and stewardship of the sort of underlying energies that can issue as violence, and the discipline and the care and the mutuality of real argument and real engagement is, it's kind of like the binding of the atom. The atom becomes unbound and this immense destructive force is released. And I think we're actually experiencing some implosion of that nature right now on campuses, where people are, where discourse, vigorous argument is being replaced by lobbying, coercion, threats of violence, right. Fear of violence.
That's right.
And I think I was groping for it in that passage. There's some way of sort of dignifying the academic enterprise in recognizing that we're working with radioactive materials, so to speak.
Right.
Working with things that people kill each other over.
That's right.
And the discipline and the covenant with one another is to do that in such a way that we aren't engulfed by violence. And right now, we're getting some sense of what that looks like.
That's right. And I just need to add that your metaphor of the atomic dangers, it's energy.
It's energy, right?
It could be used to build.
Completely.
Let me just thank you for this conversation, for taking time to come on the show to talk with me and my listeners about this. We're thinking about the Kalven Report a lot, and I'm reminded again of the expression you did from the bookstore piece about the idea about deepening the quality of one's intent, deepening the quality of one's attention. And I hope that this conversation with you will have the same effect on our listeners as it's having on me, which I think is helping deepen the quality of my attention on the Kalven Report. Not just to see it as an inherited doctrine that some people at Chicago wrote back in the glory days, but rather to see it as a report that invites us to deepen the quality of our attention to what it might mean to make space on a university while being a leader, but also making space for multiple voices, even when the stakes are high and the feelings are radioactive. So, Jamie Kalven, thank you so much.
No, it's been my pleasure.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, take care.